The CTR, or Civic Type R, originally released for the 6th generation Civic back in 1997. We haven't had one in America or North America, so people have lusted for this so badly. It was a car that I wished I could have had back in the 90s, and that ship has sailed for me in large part. And now finally, after all this time, we get it, and we get that. Now, as the title of this video suggests, you have two camps. People that want to vomit and diarrhea all over the design of this, and then you have the people that have lusted for it, that have wanted it from the day it was announced, including the owner of this car, who was on the bandwagon right away. He put his order in, he couldn't wait, he was watching for it, he was waiting to find the boats so he could stock the boats it was coming in on, and then he stocked the train yards, the truck drivers, and then finally he got it. And now he's driven it all the way from Canada to me in Illinois so I can take a look at it. He wanted me to do a video on it, and I can tell you there's a level of passion here and enthusiasm for this car that I haven't seen in a long time. So whether you hate this or like it, there's something special about this, and we're going to cover that. Now let's talk turkey about the front of this Civic. And it is still a Civic despite a Type R badge. It's based on the 10th generation architecture. Now, they've modified this to turn it into a sports car, like many eco hot hatches these days. The front end features an aluminum hood to save weight. It has an air intake duct that is functional. It helps to cool off the engine bay. I also like to stuff my flapjacks in here after I get done for a pancake breakfast. That's a good place to put them. The rest of the front end is mostly functional. They have air curtains that help move air through the front bumper along the side of the car to reduce, well, drag. And there's some things that help reduce lift here. There's some aerodynamic function in all of this. We still have these fake plastic vents, one so you can hear the horn better, the other one is just blocked off. So there's still some of that cheesiness here, but we'll talk about some of that more in depth in the shop. Let's take a look at the back. Now, the wheelbase is the same on the Type R as the regular Civic. Now, it is wider, and a lot of that has to do with changing the front brakes, the front suspension, and these wider tires and wheels. It moves it out, so you have to move the fenders out, and that's why you have these kind of tacked on looking fender bulges. It gives it that aggressive look, but it's also functional. Now, as I work my way to the back, holy shit. What is this? It looks like one of the Terminator wings that were on the 90s Civics that everybody put on, and then you found them in the junkyard. This thing is ridiculous. And these sharp edges are great because you walk around it and you're gonna bruise yourself up. It's just overkill for what this is. But hey, you know what? That's what the Type R is about. You have vortex generators on the top of the roof, which help to channel airflow so this spoiler becomes functional. It creates downforce. And the whole front to the back of the car has aerodynamic purpose that helps generate smoothness and also downforce to create stability at higher speeds. Now, let's take a look inside. This hatch. This is one of the most usable, practical, and functional parts about this car. And it's so wide, there's so much depth, and when you put the seats down, there's no crap like you have to deal with in the Focus RS. You don't have to adjust the bottom seats and screw with the headrests. All I have to do is pull this. Oh my God, it goes down like a normal car. And this becomes a totally usable space. It's one of the best, most practical parts about this car that we continue to lose with cars like the Subaru. We don't have a WRX hatch anymore. The STI is gone. So this is kind of the most usable replacement aside from maybe like a Golf R. Last but not least, this manual liftgate, easy breezy. But Honda has upgraded the struts on the back to aid in closing because the extra weight added from this monstrous spoiler. Now, the owner says he's had some binding. This thing won't close all the way in the heat, so it's something to look out for if you're an owner. But the big deal here, this decal, a Canadian exclusive VTEC turbo decal. The dealerships in Canada are being overrun by Americans crossing the border to try to buy these. The markups are insane. If you want one, they're $700, so you better get on it now. The interior of the Type R, we're not gonna beat this one up because I've already talked about it so many times with the other videos, but the differences are you have Alcantara microfiber-ish suede inserts on the door panels, the armrests, the seats. The accents are really tasteful for the most part, but then you get to this kind of reddish, cherry red trim all along the dash, and I feel like I could do without it, but that's what the Type R is about. It's always been about that, adding the red in the steering wheel. The seats are red. It just stands out and screams at you, much like the Type R badge. It's part of the experience. If you didn't have it, well, then what's the point? One of the biggest and brightest spots of this interior are these Type R seats. They are supremely comfortable. They have a ton of padding. The bolsters are a little high, and it's gonna be very difficult for somebody that is a larger person to deal with and sit in here. You're probably gonna be smushing the side bolsters. They're gonna crush. So that's something you're gonna wanna sit in this car and decide on before you're stuck with it. The shift knob is aluminum for this car. It reminds me of the S2000 CR knob with a little less weight. You have your R mode, your Type R badge in here. Really, everything's the same as a regular Civic other than that. The gauge cluster is even basically the same as the SI. So the bad things are still bad. The infotainment sucks. The fact that you have to use the touchscreen for the climate. When the car starts up, you don't have accessibility to the HVAC right away because there's so much delay and lag. It's stupid. There's no volume knob still. You have to wait for the refresh for that. But other than that, it's a Civic on the inside. And a lot of the good things that carry over from that car that I really like are all here. Now, if you want more information about the interior, just look at the other Civic videos I've done. But for now, let's head into the shop and take a look at some of the technical details of the Type R. We are in the shop without Scott. I've invited him. I don't know where he is. Don't really care. The only thing he told me is it's a waste of digital memory to record the Type R. Now, with that negative Nancy approach, I'm going to take a different one. Underneath the Type R, this is based on the 10th generation architecture. I said that in the start. So really, this looks very much like the Civic Si we just looked at. Now, there are some major differences here. This aluminum panel has an upkick to help cool things. Once we take all this paneling off, which is ridiculous to take this whole plastic tray, it's about 30 clips, various screws, but what you can see here is there is a transmission cooler, a liquid transmission cooler, because the transmission has been uprated. You can see there's a pretty good attempt at smoothing out airflow from the front to the back. Aerodynamics was a purpose. Now the major difference is you'll see there are brake ducts that go from the front bumper through this back panel, and really the only way that it works is it blows air. It doesn't really have a directional like tubing. It blows air, and then there is a piece of the dust shield on the brakes that kind of fan out to allow air to get in there to cool the brakes. This car has literally no issues with braking, and that is because it uses a monoblock Brembo caliper in the front, a 4-piston unit that is extremely efficient. They use a hybrid brake pad, which is has more metallic compound, and you can tell when you're braking, you hear a little bit of brake squeal, so you don't get a lot of fade that some of the more nerfish sports cars get. You can go pound on this on the street, you can take it to the track within reason and still, not lose your brakes as fast. So that's really nice. Now, in terms of chassis rigidity, there's a lot here that Honda did for the 10th generation Civic. There's a heavy use of structural adhesives, there's closer weld spots, and of course there's reinforcement beams and higher strength steel basically that runs under the passenger seat and behind the rear suspension. There's a lot of little bracing here that adds up to a lot. Like this nifty brace that we found that is probably the main reason why this car is so rigid. When you take all these panels off, you can see how thick it is. I like to use it as a clothing hanger, much like the S2000 exhaust. When we get to the suspension on the front, this is really the biggest major change to the Civic Type R. And you can see this, I'm gonna put this compared, this is the SI suspension. It's very basic, lightweight, typical strut-based front suspension, not a lot of girth to it. When you look at this, everything's been changed. You have all aluminum here, aluminum lower control arm, hub, knuckle, and then the knuckle design leads to a fork that is very reminiscent of double wishbone suspension. This fork attaches to the strut, and then the strut, typical design all the way up, except it has adaptive dampers, which we'll go into in a bit. As you make your way around the suspension, as you can see as it pivots and compresses, there's a stabilizer link that goes from the lower control arm to the fork. And now this is designed to help the suspension reduce torque steer, reduce some of the wheel hop effect when you have high horsepower to a front wheel drive car. The rigidity was a main focus here, and this is why this car feels less front wheel drive overall. The other thing they did is obviously to cram all this in here, it moves the wheel outboard, so it has a wider track. And that's why you can't just swap this on a regular Civic. There are modifications here to accommodate this. And of course, you have wider wheels and tires. The spring rates are higher on the Type R from a regular Civic. They're twice as firm as the regular Civic hatch, at about 263 front, 240 in the rear, or thereabouts. In the back of the Civic Type R, when you look at it, this is where it looks like a regular Civic, with exception of the exhaust, which we'll get to in a minute. When you look at it, it still has the same stamped steel lower control arms as the regular SI we looked at. Now the difference is the sway bar size. This is a solid rear sway bar. It is larger than the regular hatchback. The front is a tubular bar. It's hollow in the middle, but it is much more rigid than the regular hatchback as well. When we get to the brakes, yes, they're painted red, real fancy. It has an electronic parking brake, which you know I'm not a huge fan of. But the big story back here, like the front, is the adaptive dampers. And unlike the SI, you have 3 modes, and the modes are extremely versatile. In comfort mode, this rides, if not better, than a regular standard Civic. There is no penalty in terms of ride quality driving this car. The second is sport mode, which is how the car defaults. The damping rates go up, which means the rebound and the compression, the stroke is more aggressive. So you get a firmer ride, a more controlled ride. The last mode is Plus R, which is the most aggressive setting, and it still rides extremely well while delivering the body control. And I'll talk more about that in the driving section. But these dampers are set up extremely well, front and rear. There's literally almost nothing to complain about with the suspension setup, with the exception of these ridiculous tires. They are a 20-inch 245 30 series tire. When you look at this, there's literally no sidewall to these. Not only are they gonna wear out fast, but I can't imagine you not destroying a rim on these cars within a year if you're doing any type of real driving. I don't understand why they did this. I know it's a part of the suspension tuning to give you the directness in the steering, but I think I'd almost trade some of that off to have more usable rubber on here. The last thing to talk about is the exhaust pipes. And in Honda fashion, usually they're pretty well made. You know, the welds on them don't look the cleanest, much like the subframe in the front looks like somebody dropped it in the sand in the middle of coating it. You know, you can still tell this is a economically built car. Now this exhaust is a single piece from here to pretty much the catalytic converter, and it's gonna be super expensive to replace if you go and destroy it. Now there's some interesting parts about this. You have 3 tips. 2 of them are larger, the one in the middle is smaller. So it's versatile, it fits all types of sizes. Scott likes the smaller inlet, of course. Now the center exhaust or center muffler is to help enhance and also reduce boominess. So it creates a more throaty exhaust tone, at least for a 4-popper, but it also helps to eliminate some of the boominess or drone when you're driving, which personally I can still hear, and it's more in the back seat. Under the hood, this is where everybody is getting really damp in the underwear over this car. It's a K20 C1 turbocharged direct injected 2-liter that makes over 300 horsepower. Now that's all well and good. We can talk specs for hours, but everybody wants to talk about this. VTEC's back. And what does that mean? Not much anymore, because it's not something you feel. And the VTEC is only on the exhaust side. Now what this does have is cam phasing on both the intake and exhaust side, and that's where most of the magic and the tuning happens with this. The ECU can control cam phasing, it can increase performance, it can cut timing, it can do all the things that it needs to do to make this deliver smooth power all the way through the rev band. Like everything in these modern motors, the Type R included, it's about reducing pumping losses, reducing friction. So on the piston skirts, they use a moly coating. They use low friction piston rings. They have low friction oil seals. There's so many things they do here to reduce pumping losses, and that improves efficiency in terms of fuel economy, which this car does a really good job at, and also improves horsepower. There are many similarities between the engine in the Civic Si and the Type R motor. Not going to detail all of that, but you can read about that online, and I will link you. This is electronic wastegate. The turbo is capable of producing 23.2 psi of boost, and that is up about 3 psi from the Civic Si motor. And the way this car delivers power is extremely linear. You don't get a lot of tuning weirdness that I've seen in a lot of modern eco-powered turbocharged direct injected cars. This is one of the better turbocharged performance motors I've been in. Not the best, but it's really good for the price range. Now the big question is it going to be reliable? Honda has a history for that, but I don't want to say, hey, they've perfected this whole design. We're going to have to see in a couple years if there's any creeping or nagging issues with it. But let's take this for a drive and see how it does on the street. Welcome to the Type R video. First, we're going to talk about something important: livability and being comfortable. Now, when you get into these extreme hot hatches or sport compact cars, whatever the hell you want to call them, I've been into vehicles that are absolutely a nightmare to drive every day. They trade off too much on the sport side, and when you're trying to drive like a normal person, it's just a joke. The Type R, one of the biggest things I can tell you about this is it has 3 different driving modes, which adjust the dampers and the damping rates based on what performance setting you have. So you have Comfort, Sport, and Plus R. The Plus R mode is the most aggressive. Sport mode is what it defaults to. Every time you start the car, it doesn't remember what you put it in last, which is a pain in the ass. And then there's Comfort mode, which feels like every other Civic. It is so comfortable, so compliant, you would never guess you're in a performance car. It doesn't raise any red flags. When you put it in Sport, it's just a little bit firmer, and it's not bad at all. It's more like on the level of the Civic Si in Sport mode. And then Plus R, I think the biggest shock for me is I expected it to be totally over-dampened, like a wreck riding in it, like the Focus RS was, and that's not the case. You can tell that the engineers for this car were very careful about taking it to the absolute edge of where the car behaved well, and there's dialed it back a little bit, so you never feel like you're getting killed driving this car, and that's one of the most important things to say. There are almost no trade-offs for having the Type R. So now we're going to take this through some of the turns in Sport mode and see what the difference is with the damping and the way that this thing handles. First thing you're going to notice is, aside from being cock-blocked by the person in front of you, this car has a high level of performance. It's unbelievable how well this drives for a front-wheel drive car, and I think myself, I really didn't want to make any judgments about this car until I drove it, because how do you put 300 horsepower to the front wheels and not have it be a complete mess? So here's the reality of it. The VSA system is very aggressive in certain regards, because the VSA system, when it's on, can actively brake a wheel to help you turn in. So it's a part of the driving experience. The second thing that this car will do is the electronic power steering has its own individual separate motor, and it will also help adjust your steering effort. So if it's noticing a little bit of deviation in your course, it can actually change the angle of the steering wheel. And you don't really notice it, but that's how smart these systems are, working together with you to make sure that the car is under control. You don't feel a lot of torque steer, you don't feel weirdness, but this car does understeer. You can't get away from it. It wants to push first. So I'm gonna come to a stop here and just see what a street start is like. Plus R mode, VSA off, stability control off, and just see what it would be like if you're just at a light not revving it up. It has a soft rev limit at 3,500 RPMs. You can't rev it higher than that, so there's no point even trying. Let's take a look. The car does bog from a start if you don't get the revs up, and that's typical with any turbocharged car. You need to get the revs up to get the boost built up to get you off the line quicker. Otherwise, it's just like, hey, what's happening? And then finally it picks up, and this thing just tears all the way to the red line. It's really impressive. Let's take this through some turns, and not really hardcore, just to see how the suspension handles it. I think the biggest thing about the Type R that surprises me, I didn't expect this to ride so well. Even in Plus R mode, the suspension is just so compliant. When you're driving about 8, 9 tenths, just like street driving, I mean, people aren't gonna drive this thing flat out in the street, it's just dangerous. But you can. And that's without making any corrections, trying to get the rear end to rotate into the turns. There's minimal understeer, there's minimal push. It's something that you wouldn't expect for a car with this much horsepower to the front wheels. Now, I talk about this a lot. The older front wheel drive high horsepower cars like the Mazda Speed 3, they were horrible. It would push and push and push, and you'd just tear the steering wheel out of your hand from torque steer. That's not what this is like. Even if you don't know how to drive, it's not gonna be invasive. You're not gonna think about, oh my God, this is front wheel drive, it's horrible. Now let's talk about the steering. This has a variable gear ratio steering rack. Now what that means is it can change the ratio based on conditions. It can also change it based on the driving modes. So when you're in Sport Plus, when you get into R Plus mode or Plus R, the steering wheel gets extremely tight. The ratio gets tighter, so when you're turning, it's more immediate. Now, the lower you go down into the settings from Sport and Comfort, the more slack the steering wheel gets, the more comfortable it gets, the less resistance is there when you turn. So that should be a good thing, technically. You get immediate steering response. It feels very racy, but my problem with it is it's pretty simple. When you go into Plus R mode, the car is way too sensitive in steering for my taste. And I've been in a lot of cars, and you have to understand this. I've been in and out of some really extreme high-end sports cars. And a good sports car doesn't mean the steering has to be like instantaneous when you move it a millimeter. And I feel like the Plus R setting is trying to cater to what people think good steering is versus what actual good steering is. This disrupts the car when you turn it a millimeter and you want to turn in and the car is overreacting. So for me, I prefer the steering setting in comfort mode. Now the only problem with that in the Type R is they do not allow you any customization of these modes. It's basically your hard set. You can't mix and match the throttle modes with the steering modes. And that's a big letdown. And I think that's one of the shortcomings of this car overall. That said, the manual transmission in this car is really good. Now, I've heard people say it's the best manual transmission they've ever driven, and I think that's total horse shit. Honestly, it's good, and it's one of the better ones for a front-wheel drive modern car. But if you've been in other manual transmission cars, like the S2000, the GT86 or 86, the ND Miata, like the Porsche GT4, the GT350, all those cars have better transmissions than this. But I really like the way that it's super direct. It feels almost like it has a mechanical linkage. It doesn't, but the directness is there. Heel to toe downshifting is not a problem on this car like it was in the SI that I drove. I mean, it's just a really enjoyable car to rip on and to tear up. And even if you don't know how to use a manual transmission properly, if you can't heel to toe downshift or rev match downshift, they allow you the ability to switch on the rev matching downshift mode. And like all greatness of modern cars, you have to come to a stop and enable it in the friggin' infotainment screen. There's no physical button for that, so that's kind of a joke, but you can do it if you want to, and then you don't even have to learn how to drive stick. Well, I mean, you still have to learn how to drive stick, but you don't have to learn the nuances of driving stick. Now, somebody said this car can reach somewhere between 160 and 70 miles an hour, which I don't know. I think you need a pretty big stretch of road, but let's check it out and see how it accelerates up to, well, man speeds. that feels really good. Really, really good. I'm shocked at how quickly this car accelerates. When you look at the amount of horsepower for the weight that this car carries, you would never expect this car to pull as hard as it does. And the best part about it is the tuning. I complained about some of the tuning on the SI, and you don't have some of the weirdness here with this car that you did with the SI. There's not as much rev hang. You don't notice the power getting dialed back. And I've been beating on this car now for about 15, 20 minutes, back-to-back acceleration runs, stuff like that, and you don't feel it cutting as much power. Yes, it's heat soaking a little bit, but it's not like falling flat on its face like a lot of these eco turbocharged cars that I've been in do. So that's something really positive about the Type R as well. Something, if you're looking for a car like this, you're not gonna have to worry about it as much. There's a lot of gravel on the road, so I'm not gonna just destroy the paint on this car, but when you really pound this around, it just feels so good. The power is consistent. It's not a car that you're like, oh my God, I'm gonna lose control over. Everything's so balanced, even for front wheel drive. Like right there, normally in a front wheel drive car, it would have just plowed off the road. You would have understeered right off the road. You couldn't put the power down. In this car, even with all the driver's aids off, it just grips. And that's one of the best parts about the Type R. It's a front wheel drive car that has been designed properly to be a sportier car or a sports car. And if you're somebody that wants that, you want the practicality, you don't want to deal with rear wheel drive, or you don't have the driver's skill set up enough to move to a higher horsepower or rear wheel drive platform, this is like crack cocaine for you, because it's going to be safe. Hopefully, if you drive it responsibility, you're not going to kill yourself or others, and it's a good learning platform. So you definitely want to check this out. Final thoughts. I've decided to record this after a week of being away from this vehicle to gain some clarity. Now that the fun factor's worn off, I can tell you this. I think the new Type R is one of the best front-wheel drive cars I've ever driven. And it may even come second to the Integra Type R that came out in the US in the late 90s. And I think I prefer the Integra Type R for a few reasons. One, it's a lot more simple. There's not as much to it, while still giving you the fun to drive factor. But where this new Type R corrects all that is horsepower. For so long, we've complained, why doesn't Honda give us more and more? And finally, we have it. Now, yes, it's still in a 4-popper, but when you drive this car, it still has elements of the old naturally aspirated motor with all the torque and all the excitement of the turbo setup. I could go on and on about the mechanical aspects, how good it is to drive, that it shoots rainbows out of the exhaust pipes. You know what? Most people won't care, because everything that I keep hearing is people do not take this seriously. And a lot of it has to do with the styling. I told the owner right off the bat, I wish they had a Type S variant or a touring version that stripped the body kits off, the spoiler, and gave you all the mechanical goodness that this car has to offer. So many people will just totally blow over this car because of the styling. They can't get beyond that. And that's something for Honda to look at. They said they're going to have other Type R variants in the future, so we'll have to see. One of the biggest things is Honda reliability, durability in a sports car. You look at all Honda's past products, including this vehicle, and they've had their growing pains. The Civic Type R might have some of those issues. During my drive, I experienced this. Oh, sorry, man. Now, the first thing I thought about when I had this gear grind issue in a second, thought, okay, did I have my foot down? Did I shift? Yes, I did. I haven't had a gear grind in a manual transmission in a long time, and I think the last time was in a Honda. So I started looking around, talking to the owner, and I guess this is becoming more common. And if I'm having a problem with gear grinds, chances are other people are. Now, I'm going to make a separate video about that, but my point is this is a new vehicle for them. Modified transmission design. Now, if you're an early adopter, you might have to deal with some of these problems until they're sorted out, or they might not be an issue at all. The Civic Type R is not perfect. No car is. Some of the beauty in life is in the imperfections, and I think if you're somebody looking for this car, you're going to get practicality, drivability. You can operate this every day. You can put things in it. It's like a normal car, but with high performance at a high level for a front-wheel drive platform. I think that's the biggest thing here. There's almost no penalties to driving this every day, well, except maybe the wheel and tire combo. And the best part is the price. At 33 grand US, this is really a steal. That is, of course, assuming the dealerships aren't marking up the hell out of this car. On average, it's about $1,000 to $2,000 markup on the incoming models. Some dealerships have this marked up $10,000 to $20,000, and that is just absurd. And it takes the piss out of the excitement of a car that's attainable. This is a big difference for Honda, something to be excited about for the enthusiast crowd. And of course, it's getting ruined by greed. Now, if FCA can rein in dealerships with the Dodge Demon, Honda can do this with their dealerships. I hope that the price starts to drop down, but if it doesn't, I would contact Honda directly and complain. It's just ridiculous. But take that for what it's worth. Appreciate you watching this. Take care. A big thank you to the owner who came all the way from Canada to bring me this Type R. Thanks for coming out.
Thank you.
Are you gonna ride home like this?
Yeah, I think I'll put her on cruise and see what happens.